One of the most misunderstood patterns in avoidant attachment is the cycle of pulling away and then returning. On the surface, it feels confusing and even painful. You may ask yourself why someone who seems distant would come back at all if they truly cared. But the answer isn't as simple as lack of feeling or lack of interest. Avoidant individuals are not disconnected from emotion. In many cases, they feel deeply, but they also feel easily overwhelmed by closeness. When intimacy becomes too intense, their response is to create distance, not because they don't value the connection, but because they are trying to regulate their inner emotional pressure and regain a sense of control. What people often miss is the importance of what happens next. They return. And not just once in a random way, but in a repeated pattern. That repetition matters. When someone keeps coming back after distance, it shows the connection still holds emotional weight for them. People don't repeatedly return to something they feel nothing for. Indifference doesn't create cycles like that. Emotional investment does. Even if it doesn't look expressive or dramatic, the return itself is meaningful. It might show up as a message, a small check-in, or a quiet attempt to reconnect. But psychologically, it reflects an inner conflict between wanting closeness and fearing the loss of independence that closeness can bring. Most people misread this dynamic. They assume the distance is the truth and the return is confusion. But in many cases, the return reveals more than the withdrawal. It shows that something still pulls them back, even when their fear tells them to stay away. This doesn't mean you ignore your own emotional needs or accept inconsistency without limits. It means you begin to see the pattern clearly instead of reacting to single moments. You observe whether they continue to re-engage, whether their returns show more stability over time, and whether there is gradual progress in how long they stay connected. Because avoidant individuals rarely express attachment in direct ways. They don't always chase or openly show emotion. Instead, they reveal their inner world through patterns of approach and distance. And repeated return is one of the clearest signs that something real is still active beneath the surface. Now, another important sign is that they do open up, even if only occasionally. For someone with avoidant tendencies, vulnerability is not simple. It can feel exposing and unsafe, like losing control or risking emotional harm. So when they do share something personal, even briefly, it carries real significance. It is not about how often it happens, but about what it costs them to do it. Most people miss this entirely, because they're measuring everything through their own emotional expectations. They look for consistency, openness, and steady vulnerability. They expect regular deep conversations and ongoing emotional availability. And when that doesn't happen, they assume nothing meaningful is there. But that assumption comes from applying your emotional style to someone who operates very differently. Avoidant individuals don't open up on demand. They open up when something inside them finally feels safe enough to allow it. And that sense of safety is fragile. It can take time to build, and it can collapse quickly the moment they feel pressured, overwhelmed, or emotionally exposed. So when they do open up, even briefly, it's not random or meaningless. It's a signal. It's a moment where their defenses relax just enough for something real to come through. It could be a memory from their past, a quiet fear, or something they normally keep to themselves. And even if it sounds casual or lightly stated, what's happening underneath is still important. Because for someone avoidant, vulnerability is never automatic. It's always a risk. And people don't take emotional risks without some level of trust. Even a small disclosure usually means they see you as safe enough, at least in that moment, to hold what they're sharing. This is where your response becomes very important. If you react with pressure or try to pull more out of them, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because the experience starts to feel unsafe again. The cost of openness becomes too high. But if you stay calm, grounded, and don't turn it into something emotionally intense, you create a different experience for them. You show them that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to demands or overwhelm. And over time, that begins to change how they relate to closeness itself. Their nervous system slowly starts associating openness with safety instead of danger. And that is what real progress looks like in this dynamic. Not sudden transformation, but gradual comfort. This doesn't mean you ignore your own emotional needs or accept lack of connection without boundaries. It simply means you start noticing real growth instead of waiting for it to look perfect. Because with avoidant patterns, growth is often quiet. It doesn't arrive in dramatic emotional breakthroughs. It shows up in small shifts, slightly more sharing than before, slightly more presence, slightly more willingness to let you in. And those small shifts matter. They are signs that something is loosening internally, that the walls are not as rigid as they were. So instead of asking why they aren't opening up more, the more accurate question becomes whether they are opening up more than they used to. That is where the truth sits, not in perfection, but in direction. When you understand that, you stop chasing intensity and start recognizing depth even when it arrives in small doses. And those small moments, if handled with patience and steadiness, don't stay small forever. They gradually build into something more stable. Once you understand their patterns of returning and begin noticing these subtle moments of vulnerability, another important layer becomes clear. They actually do try to stay connected, just not in obvious ways. This is where many connections fail, not because there is no effort, but because the effort is overlooked. Avoidant individuals don't express care through constant emotional expression. They express it through controlled, manageable connection that allows them to stay engaged without feeling overwhelmed. So instead of big emotional gestures, you might see small actions, a simple message just to check in, a casual reference to something you said before, choosing to meet in situations that feel low pressure and emotionally safe for them. Individually, these things can seem minor, but together, they carry meaning. Each one is a choice to stay connected instead of withdrawing completely. Because for someone avoidant, connection is not effortless. It is something they constantly balance internally between wanting closeness and protecting themselves from it. So even small efforts often represent that internal balance leaning slightly toward connection. And this is where awareness matters. If these efforts are dismissed or not recognized, the other person can start feeling like nothing they do is enough. Over time, that can reinforce their tendency to withdraw further. But when these subtle efforts are seen and understood for what they are, the entire dynamic changes. When you begin to meet someone where they are, you're not lowering your standards, but you're also not dismissing the way they're actually trying to connect. That balance is important because people tend to grow in environments where their effort is acknowledged, not where they constantly feel like they fall short. To be clear, this is not about accepting less or convincing yourself that scraps are enough. It's about recognizing the difference between no effort at all and effort that is expressed in a way that doesn't match your expectations. Those are not the same situation. One is absence, the other is miscommunication in how care is shown. If you don't understand that difference, you can end up walking away from connections that had real potential simply because you were waiting for signals that were never going to be expressed in the way you imagined. Avoidant individuals usually don't communicate care in strong emotional declarations. They don't often say things like, "I'm fully in this," or "I care about you deeply and I'm willing to risk everything." That level of emotional exposure is not their starting point. Instead, they show interest in smaller, controlled, and safer ways that allow them to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed. And over time, if they feel emotionally safe, those limits can slowly shift. But pressure doesn't create that shift. Constant demands for more don't create it either. What allows it to develop is a balance where connection exists, but personal space is still respected. So when you notice these quieter efforts, don't rush past them. Pay attention to what's actually happening instead of what you expected to happen. Ask yourself whether this person is still making an effort to stay in your life in the ways they are capable of right now. Because if the answer is yes, then you are not looking at indifference. You are looking at cautious investment. And cautious investment, when handled with patience and clarity, can grow into something far more stable than forced emotional intensity ever can. Patience in this context is not passive waiting. It's active awareness. You're not sitting around hoping for sudden change. You're observing direction. Are they showing up a little more over time? Are they staying engaged a little longer? Are they slowly increasing their level of comfort in the connection? because those patterns matter more than perfection. Growth is not about immediate consistency. It's about movement in a clear direction. And when that direction exists, the connection is still alive in some form. Real connection is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it exists in small, repeated actions that are easy to overlook if you're only searching for intensity. But those small actions often carry the most truth about where someone actually stands. And as you begin to see these patterns more clearly, something else becomes obvious. When someone creates distance, it doesn't always mean they replace you. Many people assume that space automatically means replacement or emotional substitution. But for avoidant individuals, distance is often not about finding someone new. It's about finding relief. Relief from emotional pressure, from internal overwhelm, and from the intensity of closeness. So when they step back, they are not always running towards someone else. Often they are simply stepping away from emotional overload. And that difference is important because if someone quickly replaces you after distance, that tells you something about their attachment style and emotional priorities. But if they create space and do not meaningfully replace the connection, it suggests something else entirely, that the bond had depth that is not easily transferable. This doesn't always mean conscious intention. Avoidant individuals are not always fully aware of what they are holding internally, but it does mean the connection may still exist in their internal world, even if it is not being expressed outwardly. They can distance themselves on the surface while still carrying emotional residue underneath. They can appear detached while still holding on to unresolved feelings in a compartmentalized way, stored rather than released. And over time, if they don't fully detach, don't fully replace the connection, and still maintain some level of indirect or occasional contact, it often indicates that the emotional link hasn't been completely severed. But it's important to stay grounded in reality. This is not a reason to wait endlessly or ignore your own emotional needs. It's simply an understanding that not all distance means absence and not all silence means the end of connection. It's not about clinging to potential while ignoring reality, but about recognizing when a connection is still emotionally active, even if it isn't fully expressed. Once you see it this way, the question shifts from whether they feel something to what they are doing with what they feel. That's where discernment begins. Are they stuck in avoidance with no movement, or still circling the connection with lingering attachment? One is emotional detachment, the other is unresolved connection beneath distance. When you understand this, you stop linking distance to your worth and stop assuming replacement. Instead, you observe whether the connection is truly over or just unresolved. In many cases, what looks like closure is unfinished emotional processing. This awareness changes your response. You don't chase, compete, or shrink yourself. But you also don't rush to end something that may still be unfolding. You observe patterns over time. When someone hasn't fully replaced you, it often reflects significance rather than certainty. A key insight is that people often respond differently when given space. For avoidant patterns, pressure creates overwhelm and withdrawal, not closeness. When pressure is removed, the cycle is interrupted. Space allows them to re-engage without feeling cornered. Their return, when it happens, is often regulation, not strategy or manipulation. Reactive behavior is driven by anxiety. Grounded presence is driven by stability. One clings, the other allows. When you stay centered instead of chasing, the dynamic softens. What remains is either real disengagement or a connection given space to reveal itself clearly. It will naturally create a pull toward connection. The key difference is not how someone behaves under pressure, but how they respond when pressure is removed. That is where their true pattern becomes visible. This awareness requires patience, restraint, and trust, not just in the other person, but in yourself. When you are grounded, you stop trying to control every moment. You don't panic when space appears or assume distance means loss. You observe, allow, and respond instead of react. This creates a healthier environment where connection develops naturally rather than being forced. When space doesn't end the bond but softens it, you begin to understand how the connection actually works. At that point, you stop trying to hold everything together and instead start noticing its rhythm. When space leads to reconnection, you are not facing absence of feeling. You are seeing a bond that needs emotional freedom to exist. Looking at the full pattern, returning, vulnerability, small efforts, lack of replacement, and response to space, you begin to see direction instead of extremes. The real indicator is movement, not perfection or constant consistency. Avoidant patterns are not random, they are learned protection. Real change happens slowly through repeated experiences, not sudden shifts. So the question becomes not is it perfect, but is it changing? Are they slightly more open than before, staying present a little longer, showing small improvements in emotional comfort? If yes, then something is shifting. But discernment is key. Patience without awareness becomes waiting, and waiting without change becomes stagnation. You must separate real progress from imagined potential. Progress shows in behavior over time. Potential exists only in imagination. Confusing the two leads to investing in something that may never grow. When real progress exists, even slowly, you are responding to reality, not hope. And reality is something you can work with. Relationships are defined not by where they start, but by where they consistently move. And if someone is truly growing with you, even in small steps, then you are not waiting for love. You are watching it develop. At the end of the day, it all comes down to clarity over confusion. Not every distance means disinterest, and not every return guarantees certainty. What matters is not the intensity of moments, but the pattern over time. Whether there is movement, even if it is slow, or whether everything is simply repeating without change. Your role is not to chase answers in every shift of behavior, nor to reduce yourself to fit someone else's emotional limits. It is to stay grounded enough to see things as they are, not as fear or hope makes them appear. When a connection is real but unsteady, it often reveals itself through inconsistency mixed with return, distance mixed with re-engagement, silence mixed with small efforts to reconnect. And when you can observe that without losing yourself in it, you gain something most people miss: perspective. Because clarity doesn't come from forcing certainty. It comes from time, patterns, and honest observation. And in the end, whether a connection grows or fades, what matters most is that you never abandon your own stability while trying to understand someone else's process.